Zimbabwe is a country in Central Africa, home to some of the world's most beautiful scenery. The Victoria Falls, which is the tallest waterfall in the world, sits at the border of Zimbabwe and Zambia. Originally colonized by the British Empire, Zimbabwe finally achieved independence in the 1980s. Throughout the 80s and early 90s, Zimbabwe was off to a good start and it looked like they were on a long path to prosperity. The favorable climate made it an ideal place to grow crops such as wheat and tobacco, which they exported in large quantities. Free from colonial restrictions, the private sector started to develop and the standard of living steadily rose for average people. However, in the early 1990s, Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe made some fateful policy errors which sowed the seeds for the country's eventual hyperinflation and economic collapse. He implemented a land reform policy that expropriated the farmland of white farmers and gave them to native Zimbabwean residents. The rationale of the policy was to return the land to its rightful owners. During Zimbabwe's colonial period, British colonists took the land from the native people to create their own plantations. Even after colonialism ended, much of the farmland was still controlled by the descendants of the white colonists. However, the land reform had some severe unintended consequences. The native farmers who took over the land often had little experience and lacked access to advanced farming equipment. Furthermore, the land reallocation program was subject to rampant corruption. Much of the land was given to political allies of Mugabe, even if they did not have the ability to properly farm it. The results were catastrophic. Without proper know-how, food production started to decline by double digits, and there were frequent food shortages. Tobacco production, which had been an important driver of exports, also suffered large declines. With exports diminishing, the Zimbabwe dollar started to depreciate rapidly against foreign currencies, causing prices of imported goods to increase. The decrease in food production and currency depreciation led to declining living standards for the people and frequent famines. But despite these issues, the country was not yet experiencing hyperinflation. This would only come later. In 2001, the Second Congo War broke out, with rebel forces trying to unseat the existing government in the country. The war was one of the most deadly the continent had ever seen, with more than 5 million deaths by the end. Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe was a political ally of the Congo government, so sent military forces to help them fight the rebels. At the peak, he sent over 12,000 Zimbabwean troops to the Congo and invested heavily in state-of-the-art war equipment. The Congo War was a bloody affair with intense guerrilla fighting and jungle warfare. After 2 years of involvement, Mugabe gave up and ordered his forces to return home. The war cost a lot of money, and the country's meager tax revenues were not nearly enough to fund it. In order to pay soldiers' salaries and purchase equipment, Mugabe resorted to printing money. This would be the start of the hyperinflation. By 2001, inflation had crossed the triple-digit milestone, with consumer prices increasing 112%. Retirees' savings were wiped out and the majority of the population was forced into abject destitution. The inflation caused the Zimbabwe dollar to depreciate, making foreign goods extremely expensive. This was a problem for Mugabe because he relied on foreign imports to buy military equipment and other essential goods for government operations. Instead of reforming monetary policy to reduce inflation, Mugabe decided that to solve the problem, he would just print even more money. Even if foreign import prices go up, the government can still always afford to buy them by printing the money. The government continued to print money at a faster and faster pace. By 2006, the rate of inflation was beginning to reach the point of absurdity, with prices rising 1,281%. When inflation becomes so high, it becomes difficult to make daily purchases. Citizens had to carry bundles of cash worth millions of dollars just to make small purchases such as fruit and bread. People's nominal wages were increasing as well, but not fast enough to keep up with the inflation. You might receive $1 billion for your weekly paycheck, but by the end of the week, prices had risen so much that the $1 billion now becomes almost worthless. By the mid-2000s, hyperinflation had become a major problem. With prices rising so fast, it became almost impossible to make any investments or long-term planning. With the value of wages degrading so rapidly, working a job became a fool's errand and unemployment reached as high as 80%. The economy barely ceased to operate, with people resorting to hunting and scavenging for food. Mugabe saw the economic conditions of his country were unsustainable and knew something had to be done. However, he refused to stop printing money. With 80% unemployment, the country's tax revenues were almost non-existent. The only way the government could fund its operations was by printing more money. So he thought of a simple solution. He just outlawed inflation. It became illegal for a store or a food market to raise the prices of their goods. He went as far as even sending some bakers to jail for 4 months for the crime of raising bread prices. Obviously, this policy was a complete disaster. With stores unable to charge fair market prices, they had no way of making any profits. They did not have the money to purchase goods to stock their shelves, and there were widespread shortages of essential items. Within a few months, the price-fixing policy became obviously unworkable, and Mugabe was forced to abandon it. By 2008, inflation had increased so fast that it had to be measured in scientific notation. The estimated inflation rate for 2008 was 2.315 times 10 to the 9th power. Prices were sometimes increasing tenfold on a daily basis. It had gotten to the point where the Zimbabwe dollar was basically a useless piece of paper. To make calculations easier, the government started issuing notes with higher and higher denominations. They started with $1 million notes. When those became worthless, they moved to $1 billion notes. And finally, they started issuing the infamous $100 trillion note. By 2008, the government was creating $170 trillion every week. They were printing money so fast that they would frequently run out of paper for new bills. But the people had finally had enough. They started paying for transactions with foreign currencies, such as US dollars, which were smuggled in. People without access to foreign currencies resorted to old-style barter systems where they would trade livestock and clothing items with each other. Mugabe's infinite money printing experiment had finally failed. No matter how many $100 trillion bills he printed, they could not buy him anything because nobody would accept them as payment anymore.